All right, AP US history. Here's our Cold War notes. The Cold War, is going to basically be the rest of the semester, just about for us. It's a long period in U.S. history. It's from about 1945, 1991, when World War II ends, and then to quote Winston Churchill, the War of the Giants ends and the War of the Pygmies begins. We're starting period 8 now, which you can look over there on the board and see period 8's key concepts listed up there. But the Cold War really starts from a lot of anxieties from both the Soviets and the Americans. We had a kind of shaky alliance during World War II. Even though we could fight for a common military objective of defeating Hitler, we could never really get on the same page as far as how the post-war world should be structured. And we had two very different political and economic systems. Well, starting out in the United States, we've already talked about how we were the most dominant post-war economy in the world. There was a lot of concern among people that servicemen would need help readjusting. So we've talked about the passage of the GI Bill of Rights, which would give loans and pay tuition for veterans coming home from the war. To try to continue to have full employment after the war, Truman's administration passed the Employment Act of 1946. And there was some inflation after the war. There were a few strikes after the war, and our next slide will address that. But also, this was when Congress passed the 22nd Amendment. Now, we had a majority Republican Congress while you had Truman in the White House, and this was really a reaction to FDR being elected 4 times. And you see this button. This was before Roosevelt's third election. It says Washington wouldn't, Grant couldn't, and Roosevelt shouldn't. They're against the third term. Another kind of humorous button from the Times said no man is good 3 times. So there was a lot of push to not break that 2-term precedent, which Roosevelt did. So now it's constitutionally written that you can't break the 2-term precedent by the Republicans. All right, going back to the strikes. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947 over President Truman's veto. All right, now you see here this outlawed the closed shop. If you remember from our unit with labor unions, closed shop is where every employee has to agree to sign a contract saying that they'll only work if they're in a labor union. This also allowed certain states to become right to work, like North Carolina is now, which is why North Carolina does not have a teachers union. Basically, for the most part, unions are outlawed in North Carolina. You might remember from your civics class. This outlaws secondary boycotts. This is where you have one union go on strike or try to promote a boycott because they're sympathetic with another union that's striking. This also gives the president power of what's called an 80-day cooling off period when there's a proposed strike in an area that he says is vital to national security. And you see here it says, Mr. President veto the Taft-Hartley. Some people called this the slave labor bill. This would be people who were working class usually. So President Truman wasn't a fan of this. The Republicans in Congress overrode him, though. And in the South, there wasn't a whole lot of strong union feeling. Union feeling was usually more confined to the North and Northeast. All right. After the war, we have an economic boom that lasts for about 20 years. This is a kind of rarity in American history. We have economic growth that's sustained for 2 decades. I've got there that income doubled, then it doubled again. But around this time, we also have a whole lot of societal changes. We're going to go through the civil rights movement during this time period. This is also when Johnson's Great Society is going to get some changes such as Medicare and Medicaid passed, sort of a continuation of some of Roosevelt's New Deal programs. And this post-war boom does make the U.S. the economic leader in the world. People did what they call living the American dream, which you see that image right there is from the 50s. We've got the family having the cookout in their backyard with, your basically all-American family with your kids playing the pool, riding the bike, on a boat, things like that. But we'll see that that wasn't quite the American dream that everybody had. I do have there that women were 25% of the workforce, and remember they were up to almost 40% of the workforce during the war, so some women were returned to the home after the GIs came home from the war. All right, as a result of that post-war prosperity, we ended up really increasing the military budget, even more than what had been in World War II, just because of the Cold War arms race. There's a lot of technology that's going to be used for defense. We also are going to get a lot of cheap energy during this time period. There's a lot of oil coming in from the Middle East. And then we also have the agribusiness sector by this time is making up, or by the 1990s, only 2% of the workforce you see, but we're still feeding much of the world. So agribusiness is really how sort of farming is becoming industrialized. All right, and we talked during the end of the World War II era notes about the Sun Belt. So you see here this shaded red area on the map is going to be what we call the Sun Belt again. So we got the bottom part of our state. But this is when, again, people start migrating to the Sun Belt and away from the Northeast and Midwest, which is going to be called the Rust Belt now. And it starts to shift the political power structure in the United States as the population starts to shift. All right, and families who had the money to do it started to leave cities and go out towards the suburbs. And I'll come back to this slide, but you see we have a suburb right there. That's Levittown, New York on Long Island. This is starting in the late 40s by a guy named William Levitt. And we have these huge neighborhoods where every house looks exactly alike. And this is the beginnings of modern suburbia. Well, I said the beginnings, all the way back to the 1920s when we were talking about the 20s boom. We saw some sort of early modern versions of suburbs, but the 1940s when we used to associate with Levitt towns and things like that. And we have a lot of minorities in urban areas here because we have what we call white flight. So there were some government programs to help with federal housing and things like that, but you see in this cartoon, we've got on the left a very nice looking suburban high school, and the teacher saying today class we're going to learn about the bad old days, and on the right we've got urban school, looks like it's decaying. Says they're learning about when we thought separate could be equal. And the cartoonist's point here is that as the white flight happens and the wealthier families move out to the suburbs, the inner cities start to lose their tax base, and you have a decaying infrastructure in the inner cities. All right, so we also have a post-war baby boom. We talked during the Great Depression era about people getting their lives kind of put on hold for a while. Well, after World War II, when GIs come home from the war, everybody makes up for lost time. We have a huge increase in the birth rate from about 1945 through 1960, and that chart shows it pretty well. And people born during this time period are called the baby boom generation. And you see the bottom of the slide says this is leading to the current grading of America. That was where they used to be on tests that my kids sometimes didn't understand. The grading of America means that those baby boomers are now starting to get to the age where they'll be collecting Social Security and things like that. So it's starting to put a little bit more of a strain on the Social Security system. So there's a debate nowadays in the United States as to whether or not people who pay into the Social Security system their whole lives are actually going to see the benefits of that. Will that system survive till some younger workers reach the age where they can receive benefits? All right, but shifting back to the shaky alliances between the Allies. The Allies throughout the war were meeting and trying to plan military strategy, but the post-war plans were always kind of the sticking point where we could never really get along as allies. So in 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meet at Tehran in Iran, and Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to open a Western Front, which is going to take a little bit of pressure off the Soviets fighting the Germans in the East. Remember, the Soviets were suffering huge losses, battles like Stalingrad, and the Soviets were kind of given free rein in the East. The British really wanted to make sure that the Americans and the British were given access to Yugoslavia and Greece, places like that, where they didn't want Soviet influence to be so strong. But FDR was trying to promote that old Wilsonian idea from the Treaty of Versailles of self-determination. So he said, let's kind of let these people of the East go as they want, which, we learned later they wouldn't be allowed to go as they want. They would go as Stalin wanted. All right, then Yalta, our next conference, there's a little bit of debate as to whether or not there was betrayal going on. And at Yalta, Roosevelt really starts to kind of play up to Stalin a little bit, and Churchill is the guy who feels like remember I used a comparison between Roosevelt and Churchill Churchill was always kind of courting Roosevelt. Well, now Churchill feels like he's not getting the job done. Like Roosevelt's kind of left him going after Stalin because Roosevelt was smart. He was playing the political game. But there's some very important agreements made at Yalta. You see here that we agree that after the war, Berlin was going to be divided into different zones of occupation, and also the whole of Germany was going to be divided into zones of occupation. There were going to be free elections held in some Eastern European countries, which that was a promise that we don't believe Stalin kept. We laid the baseline plans for the United Nations, and then Stalin also agrees that he's going to enter the war against Japan after Germany is defeated. All right. This also is going to grant Stalin some control over Japanese territory and part of Manchuria. And a lot of critics of Roosevelt thought that he kind of sold out one of our allies, Chinese nationalist leader named Chiang Kai-shek, and also he kind of sold out Poland. And we'll see in a couple of slides about the conflict between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao in China. And Yalta really set the stage for the conflict in the post-war world. And at our next conference, we'll have Truman replace Roosevelt. Remember, Truman's one of those guys that finally gets added Roosevelt's tick after Roosevelt keeps hopping vice presidents throughout his different presidential races. And see, he's not college educated. To the best of my knowledge, I think he was the last president that we can say that of. I've got there, he was honest, he was authentic. He said the buck stops here. It means he's not going to pass the problems on to somebody else. He's going to take care of things himself. Potsdam, when Truman meets with the Allies, Truman, towards the end of that conference, tried to actually hint that we had something like the atomic bomb. He let the British in on the secret. The British were part of the planning of the Manhattan Project to some degree. But he hints to Stalin that we have a big weapon of mass destruction that may be helpful, which he didn't really give him the plans, obviously. And Stalin just kind of says, well, I hope you'll use it against Japan soon. Well, Truman thought he had a big secret. Stalin actually had a guy named Klaus Fuchs, who was a British physicist who had been spying while he was working for the Manhattan Project, spying for the Russians. So the Russians were much more aware of what was going on than we actually realized at the time. All right, so there's a lot of distrust between the Soviets and the Americans at the end of the war. So we've got the world set for this clash of ideologies between capitalism and communism. And remember, the United States didn't actually recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. And then the the Soviets were also kind of upset that we hadn't opened the second front as soon as they thought we should have, which could stop some of this devastation you see here at Stalingrad. And also I've got there that the Soviets were a little, ticked off that the U.S. and the British had blocked them out of the bomb development secrets. All right, Stalin had proclaimed at Yalta, remember, that he would have friendly borders in Eastern Europe and Asia. He had said that he was going to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, which at Potsdam we pointed out that we didn't think was actually happening. So Potsdam is when the alliance kind of starts to crumble. But both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were trying to export their ideologies around the world. So really the Cold War is fought through a bunch of proxy wars in Asia and even close to home in Central America, places like that. Well, we talked about after World War I, the League of Nations as a world peacekeeping agency, and it wasn't something the United States ever even joined because our Senate wouldn't ratify that Treaty of Versailles. Well, the post-war world in 1945 is going to be a little different because the UN, or United Nations Conference that meets in San Francisco, you see there that I think that's the Chilean delegation signing the UN Charter. This is going to actually be a peacekeeping body that sticks. It's still around today. It's got a 5-member Security Council, which is the U.S., Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. And the United States does agree to this. Our Senate does approve it. It's based on the idea of mutual cooperation. But there is still a little bit of disagreement among the Americans and the Soviets in this about uses of the atomic bomb and things like that. And we'll see that when you get to the Korean War notes, the only reason that the United States was able to get the Security Council to make some decisions there was because the Soviets had boycotted a meeting. All right, and we've also got this problem of how we're going to deal with post-war Germany. So we started last week, right before the World War II test, to talk about some psychological experiments that dealt with whether or not people were following orders or whether or not they had a bigger role in the Holocaust. Well, you see here several people, including right here one of the key figures, Hermann Goering, he's that guy on the corner of the box, who were the top-level Nazis, and some of these were executed after the war, just like some of the Japanese war criminals were executed, guys like Hideki Tojo. Even though the emperor was allowed to stay around Japan, he just had to admit that he wasn't a divine figure, as he had claimed. All right, so now that we have a divided Europe, Germany's divided into zones of occupation. Stalin takes over what we call satellite nations in Eastern Europe. These are countries that he heavily influences. And Churchill gives a speech where he states that an iron curtain has been dropped across the continent. So you see here, there's an iron curtain across this cartoon. It says, by order of Joe, which is obviously Joseph Stalin. Well, we've got the portly little Churchill fellow here trying to look under the Iron Curtain. And that's setting up the way world history is going to be until the late 80s, early 90s. And we'll see that Stalin actually tried to completely block off Berlin from the Allies for a while, and the United States was able to fight that off with something we're going to call the Berlin Airlift. That basically allows West Berlin to survive. All right, and finishing this section before I start part 2 of the video, I'm going to say that the USSR, or the Soviet Union, we had lost their cooperation by 1946. This is when the Cold War really hardens, and it really goes back to places like Iran, where we're talking about producing oil and things like that.